Hello, this is American History 2, Lecture 2. We were talking about identity politics coming up in the 1960s, and in Lecture 1 we talked about African Americans, Mexican Americans, and the American Indian movement. Well, this lecture I'd like to talk about the women's rights movement. It's fair to say that we did talk about how environmentalism was launched by essentially one book, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which hit the shelves in the very end of 1962 and really became the talk of the country in 63. So that's environmentalism springing out of a book. Well, what's sometimes called second wave feminism was largely born from another book. It's a book written published in 1963 called The Feminine Mystique. And it was by a woman named Betty Friedan. The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. In the book, Friedan basically wanted to say that women in America were being relegated to second-place status as citizens in the business world and many other ways by the fact that Americans were socialized, both boys and girls, to think of females essentially as homemakers, mothers, wives who should look pretty for their husbands, that kind of ultra-traditional feminine life based in the home, not in the workplace. The chief role of a woman was to become a wife and mother, and that there wasn't much need for a broader public role in either politics or economics or any other aspect of American life, because her husband took care of that for the family. That is what Friedan was saying girls were being socialized into as they grew up, and boys were being socialized to expect that of girls when they became women, and that this traditional femininity, this putting of women on a pedestal, as in some ways morally superior to men and the like perhaps, but that kept them out of the fray of public life. That a woman on a pedestal is never going to become the CEO of a major corporation because she's too perfect, too high, too above, too beautiful to get in the trenches and do hard work and the like. Or the ideal mother is not going to want to leave her kids to go to take a job or something. So Friedan's book started a major conversation about the role of women. Were women relegated to second-class status? Most of the legal restrictions on women's rights had gone. Women got the vote, as you know, nationally in 1920 and some states before that. The restrictions on married women owning separate property were, I think, entirely gone by 1963, but those formal technical second-class status for women issues didn't account for the whole story. There were relatively few women in the higher levels of the business world. In the early 1960s, female lawyers and doctors were still very rare, and there were only a handful of female politicians in the U.S. Senate and House, for example. None in the U.S. Senate, a couple in the U.S. House. So, in no way were they represented politically as public figures, anything remotely like the 51% of the population females comprise. And the same could be said in the higher levels of the business world. Women in the office in the early 1960s were still mostly secretaries and typists and the like. Very, very few female business executives in the early 1960s. So Friedan was asking, why is that? Could it be where our culture has to change in some way? But, the rise of identity politics combined with this book caused some women to start saying, and some male allies to these women, to start saying, women should organize the way blacks have, the way now Mexican Americans are. The National Organization for Women would be founded in 1966, now National Organization of Women. as a pressure group, rather like the NAACP, to advocate for women's rights. Now, part of the reason why they were effective in many areas was, again, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, we talked about the ways in which African Americans benefited from that. But there was also a Title VII to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which forbade discrimination in public accommodation on the basis of sex. Let me see if I can... yeah, I'm afraid I don't see that, the exact wording. But anyway, the result was that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 forbade discrimination in employment on the basis of race, color, national origin, or religion. So if you're a business, you have to not discriminate on the basis of those factors in hiring. But then Title VII said on the basis of sex. You cannot discriminate against women, in other words, in hiring decisions. Now, the irony is that this actually made it into the bill. It was not initially part of the bill, Title VII on not discriminating against women in employment practices was not originally part of this bill. It was put in there by a congressman who was hoping to torpedo the bill entirely. He was a Southerner who didn't want the racial protections of the Civil Rights Act. He thought it was such a ridiculous idea that you couldn't discriminate on the basis of sex in hiring decisions, that his colleagues in Congress would vote against the bill because of this, well, they call it a poison pill. Put something in that people just can't stomach, and even if they wanted most of it, they'd have to vote it down because this bad thing they didn't want was in it. He took it to be so crazy to say employers couldn't choose between men and women that they wouldn't approve it, but they did. Now, it took a while. It took years, actually, for this to make its way up to the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is now a justice on the Supreme Court, is one of the lawyers who helped to push this into the Supreme Court and get victories on Title VII. And for a long time, it didn't have a great deal of impact. People still kind of took it for granted that some jobs are for men and some jobs are for women. You can bet the better paid executive jobs were still, in most people's eyes, still basically a male preserve. There was still a bias that the man is the breadwinner of the family and the woman's income is a kind of supplement. So it's okay to pay women less and so on. That was a cultural prejudice that lasted a long time. You might even say some ways perhaps it still exists today, but I'll leave that to you to decide. But in any event, the National Organization for Women was formed in '66 to push for making this law a reality, so that in employment situations, as I say, most legal discrimination against women were gone, but now they want to go into the business world and say that women should have a fair shot with men at any position, in any business, in any industry. There shouldn't just be male preserves in business. Well, that's, politically and economically now, at least on the books, women are equal with men. But Friedan's critique had been a cultural one, and there were more radical feminists who wanted to redefine the very concept of femininity in America, of womanhood in America. And some of these more radical feminists would do things like in 1968, a massive protest against the Miss America pageant, I think they threw blood, if memory serves, on some of the contestants, for this, what they saw as a perpetuation of stereotypes about women and beauty and the like, and they were more aggressively pushing against that. I leave it to you to decide how much that has stuck. I mean, even the Miss America pageant has changed a great deal in the last 50 years. So I leave it to you to ponder those questions. But it's in the 1960s, and then more effectively in the 1970s, that you see this identity politics. In the mid-1970s, the Equal Rights Amendment will be proposed, a constitutional amendment that would ban all discrimination on the basis of sex in every area, that all citizens had to be treated equally under the law, regardless of sex. That came very close to getting the two-thirds. It passed the House and passed the Senate, went to the states for ratification. It came within 2 votes of being ratified, but it was defeated. It was defeated in part by concerns about the military. Could women be kept out of combat if the ERA was passed? Now, today, women are in combat, but in the mid-1970s, a lot of Americans couldn't get their minds around the idea of women going into battle in the U.S. military. So this frightened a great many people that their daughters might be drafted. Remember that the draft had only just ended when this was going on. That their little girls might be soldiers wasn't yet in a lot of people's minds. And that and things like, can we have separate men and women's bathrooms? These kind of things became part of the conversation. And so what had seemed like an obvious approval, an obvious ratification of the ERA, slowed and then stopped. Phyllis Schlafly, and in your assignments I've given you, you could, if you want, write an essay on Phyllis Schlafly, largely led the conservative resistance. And she was a former beauty queen who, basically she defended more traditional visions of femininity in America, women's roles, wanting to honor the homemaker and so on. And so she became a kind of crusader against the more radical aspects of feminism. Phyllis Schlafly. So you have a choice later in the week to write an essay on Betty Friedan or Phyllis Schlafly, a short essay, a couple of paragraphs. So you'll do a little research and get on that soon. God bless.